Hello readers, I'm the Avid reader and today we're reviewing World Order, written by Henry Kissinger in 2014. So Henry Kissinger is one of the most famous American foreign policy statesmen. He was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor under American Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. And he is a realist, but an interesting thing with this book is he values two things in American foreign policy: legitimacy and power. So although a realist, he understands the importance of freedom for the United States in international relations. And this book is about analyzing the different visions of world orders different regions of the world have had. So you have Europe, you have the United States, you have China, India, the Middle East, Iran. And he starts his book by talking about how the beginning of establishing a world order is maintaining a balance between legitimacy and power. And legitimacy, you can relate that to freedom in a sense, and power, you can relate that to the realist vision of geopolitics. The first two couple chapters are a history of geopolitics in Europe. So the unique thing with the European world order is that it has always been disunited. They were kind of united during the Roman era, but since then they have never been united. Some countries have tried to unite them, but in practice it has never happened. And during the 30 Years' War, you could actually see the importance of the balance of power, where although you had wars between Protestant and Catholic nations, France, a Catholic nation, sided with the Protestant nations to balance against the Catholic Austria. So here you can see the preeminence in geopolitics in wars over religion. And since the Treaty of Westphalia, there's been an understanding that states in a sense are equal between each other, that you're not really supposed to interfere in their internal affairs, and that we always have to maintain a balance of power. And any state that tries to disrupt it and become a regional hegemon, you will have a coalition of states that forms to stop them. So after the French Revolution, when Napoleon tried to become the European hegemon, you had a coalition of states that formed to overthrow him. So after Napoleon's defeat, the European balance of power was reinstated and France was made a regular middle country. And something with the European balance of power is that Russia has always been an oddball in it. So sometimes they intervene in European affairs, sometimes they don't really bother with it. They're kind of wishy-washy with it. So before the French Revolution, Prussia was almost destroyed because of the reckless foreign policy, but Russia just changed their mind in the middle of the war and didn't destroy Prussia when they had the opportunity. After the unification of Germany, you had the disruption of the balance of power, and it went from a flexible system to a rigid two-bloc alliance system. So after that, Europe's Westphalian balance of power was disrupted in Europe itself. And after World War II, Western Europe's foreign policy was conducted by the USA. And since the end of the Cold War, you have the formation of the EU, where you actually have Europe united, with Germany being in a dominant position and the United States backing the EU. After that, Kissinger goes into Islam's vision of the world order. So he argues that the Islamic civilization seeks to establish their own version of world peace. All places that are Muslim are peaceful. All places that are non-believers, we have to go to war with them. We have to carry out jihad to establish Islam, and then we will have world peace. So the Islamic world order is inherently warlike, since everyone has to be Muslim, otherwise we're gonna start wars. And one thing unique with the Middle East in the Cold War is that they were not really backing the Western or Eastern bloc. So Egypt was kind of initially pro-Russia, but you have the shifts based on their national interest, and they never really sided fully with the West or the East. And they were secular, nationalistic, non-Islamic regimes. Interestingly, since the 70s, although the Middle East has been united around nationalism and hating Israel, relations between Israel and the Muslim world has kind of improved since the 70s. They've signed several peace treaties with Egypt and with Syria, and things are improving kind of between Israel and the Arab world. But after the Cold War, you have the resurgence of Islam. And Kissinger talks about the Arab Spring, where we view it as a democratic revolution, but actually the Islamic version of that was that, okay, Egypt has one election and they elect an Islamist. That's the only election, and now we're gonna oppress everyone. So you don't really have a democratic tradition in Egypt. It's a zero-sum game where you're gonna have one tribe that dominates over the other. So probably in Middle Eastern countries, you're usually going to have one form of dictatorship or another. The only question is who is in charge. But they're never going to give up power willingly. Even if they have elections, it's inherently intolerant. Next, Kissinger moves on to Iran. Iran or Persia, they have a statecraft tradition. They are quite pragmatic, and they base everything on their national interest, and they deceive when it's in their interest to do so. But since the Islamic revolution in Iran in 1979, Iranian rhetoric has been vehemently anti-Western and Islamic fundamentalist, and their vision of Islam does not really have any borders. So it doesn't stop at Iran, so they're gonna destabilize things in the Middle East to propagate Shia Islam, and they're gonna challenge the Westphalian world order of sovereignty to institute their version of Islam. That's the rhetoric, at least. And this book is written in 2014, so this is when you had negotiations between Iran and other countries under nuclear weapons. And Kissinger talks about how, at least in 2014, the Iranians are very close to being able to acquire nuclear weapons. He says that although they're negotiating about nukes, they don't want to give up the capacity to create them eventually. So at least in 2014, Kissinger argues that Iran had the capacity to develop nuclear weapons in a period of 6 months if they wanted to. They have the technology necessary to do so, although they haven't done it yet. So the relationship the United States has with Iran is quite unclear, actually. Next, Kissinger moves on to Asia, and Asia is not really a single block, so he goes over different countries, but it is based on the Westphalian system of sovereignty and the national interest and of balancing against each other. So in East Asia, you have Russia and China and the United States and Indonesia and other countries balancing against each other. Nobody's really dominant. The one conclusion he reaches about Japan in this book is that Japan will side with the most powerful country. They will not base geopolitical decisions on democratic ideals. So if China ever becomes more powerful in Asia than the United States, then Kissinger implies that Japan would switch to China, as Japan has a tradition to reinventing itself a lot. And in the Cold War, you had India, who chose to be neutral, so they didn't side with the Soviets or the United States because it was not in their national interest. And then you have China's vision of the world order, where they have a Confucian hierarchical view. So historically, when states went to visit China, they were treated as tributes. So a foreign diplomat was not treated as an equal to the Chinese emperor. But since then, China has had to adapt to historical realities, and they have formed a closer relationship with the United States now, and they will not become a democracy at all. But there is an interest for the United States and China to coexist and to collaborate on some important issues. And the final world order vision Kissinger talks about is the United States. So traditionally, the US has rejected the vision of the balance of power. Their vision has always been democratic idealism. Their geopolitics in the 19th century was basically, okay, we're the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but we're not gonna interfere in Europe. We don't really have an interest there on what happens. But that changed with Teddy Roosevelt, who decided, okay, we're going to be the main influencer in the balance of powers. So after the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt successfully negotiated a peace treaty to make sure that Japan did not become too powerful, and he also maintained a balance of power between Japan and Russia and China during that time. And Teddy Roosevelt's view on World War I is very different from Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt believed they should have intervened on the side of the Allies much earlier to re-establish the balance of power, as Germany was growing in power and they could become threatening to the United States eventually. But afterwards they would re-establish the balance of power instead of perpetrating some democratic idealist vision of international relations. But Woodrow Wilson handled World War I differently, as we know. He made it a war for democracy and really believed that after World War I we should establish international institutions and disregard the balance of power. But in the interwar period, the problem with these international institutions is that they were powerless, so countries ignored them. So then you have World War II, and then you have FDR, who actually finds a way to enforce these principles, kind of. So he sets up the UN with the USA as the guarantor of international order, kind of. And Harry Truman cements this system, but he also carries out the policy of containment to make sure that Soviet communism does not spread. So Truman realized the threat of communism much better than Roosevelt. And he did this by consolidating Western Europe through the Marshall Plan and through guaranteeing Western Europe's defense. And then he intervened in the Korean War when North Korea invaded South Korea. But the problem is the USA intended to take over North Korea up to the Chinese border, which scared China, so they also intervened in the Korean War and killed a lot of Americans and brought it to a stalemate where they had to re-establish the status quo. But initially in the Cold War, you had a bipartisan, united vision of the United States being legitimately the guarantor of freedom in the world, fighting against evil. But then you had the Vietnam War, which was popular initially, But because the US had some bad military strategy, the media portrayed the US as an illegitimate power in the war, even though it was North Vietnam who started the war, and this led to America's withdrawal eventually. It also made enemies of the United States realize, okay, we just need to wear you down and then you will leave eventually and then we can win our own war. So that's what North Vietnam did. That's what's happened kind of in the Middle East, where the Taliban wore out the USA, you could say. Kissinger talks about Nixon, and Nixon finally accepted the geopolitical realities. Okay, you have to recognize there's a balance of power, and it's a good thing. So although he was a virulent anti-communist, he tried to maintain close relations with both the Soviet Union and China to make sure that they would not team up against the USA, and he successfully maintained the balance of powers. Kissinger points out, we remember Nixon for a lot of bad things, but he did a lot of good international relations actually. And after that you have Reagan, who's very militarily competitive, but also an idealist, who supported democracy and was anti-communist. And this combination led to the USA winning the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And after that, Kissinger talks about George W. Bush's foreign policy and that it was based on this democratic idealism. So after 9/11, you have the USA justifying their war because the people they're attacking while they violated international norms. And so 9/11 actually activated NATO's alliance to go into Afghanistan. Then in Iraq, Bush justified the war by claiming that they're gonna institute a democracy in Iraq, which they did, although that did not really succeed that well in the long run. And the problem with these foreign policy goals of establishing freedom in Iraq and Afghanistan is that people get sick of war eventually in democratic countries. So after that you have the election of Obama, who disengages in Iraq, and then you have the resurgence of ISIL. So you can see really how the United States has a foreign policy partially based on geopolitics, partially based on idealism, and when that's not well balanced, things can go wrong. And the final thing Kissinger talks about is nuclear weapons and technology. So the nuclear weapons balance of power is a high stakes game. We have nukes to make sure you don't screw around with us, and we're prepared to turn this war to hell to prevent you from going too far. But then you have also other countries who want to acquire nuclear weapons because they're not really sure what they can depend on and they want to calm down their competitors. So there's a risk of proliferation and maybe some nuclear miscalculations. So the nuclear risk could increase, but it can be managed through the non-proliferation regime. And the final thing Kissinger talks about is the influence of the internet and technology in general. And technology has developed very fast in the past decades, so things are changing constantly. And with the rise of technology now, Kissinger sees a future where you have the risk of a president being elected based on appealing on people's emotions found through data gathered from the internet. So you could have the rise of a new demagogue who seeks on getting elected. Someone who does that is not necessarily someone who cares that much about foreign policy, because understanding foreign policy means reading a lot instead of trying to manipulate the crowd to get elected. And that's the book. So how would I rate World Order by Henry Kissinger? I'm gonna give it a 7 out of 10. So I agree with Kissinger's central message about this thing that you need to balance legitimacy and power, or that you need to balance the idea of we're gonna expand liberty, democracy, but you also need to take into account the forces of order to facilitate that, because otherwise if you have chaos, it actually may be counterproductive when you seek to expand liberty. Even though the central message is correct, I have some problems with this book. Kissinger is born a German, and something I've noticed is that German speakers, they like to write books with a lot of complicated words. So he overcomplicates this subject with some esoteric words. And then one big problem with this book towards the end is his rose-colored tinted glasses on American presidents, where he talks about them and how they did this or that foreign policy, but in the long run, that was actually a good thing. He speaks very positively of what Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt did. So he doesn't show any hint of understanding that Woodrow Wilson is the worst president ever. So you can see the establishment view of viewing Woodrow Wilson positively, while actually Woodrow Wilson is the reason for screwing up a lot of our world. And then when he talks about Franklin Delano Roosevelt's close relationship with Stalin and ignoring Churchill, he talks of that as if it's a good thing, when no, it's not. Roosevelt was very naive of communism. And Kissinger does not go into detail in this book when talking about Nixon that he was involved in the peace treaty with North Vietnam and that ended with the invasion of South Vietnam. So the Vietnam War was for nothing because South Vietnam got invaded. And he talks about how, yeah, the Vietnam War ended and that was bad for the United States, but Kissinger is partially responsible for that himself. He was involved in the peace process, so he doesn't really take the blame for some problems that came about in the United States, partially because of him. But otherwise, there's a lot of good geopolitical content in this book, and you really understand the different visions of the Islamic world, of the balance of power in Europe, of China's sense of superiority, and of the United States' democratic idealism. So it has some flaws, but it's still a decent book, a 7 out of 10, and I would still recommend you to read it. And if you're a realist, you're gonna like this book a lot, probably. And even if in global politics you have the liberal vision, it's still a worthwhile read. If you wanna see how China is changing the world order, then I would recommend you to check out my book review of The Avoidable War by Kevin Rudd, who's a former Australian Prime Minister. That's a good book analyzing international relations dynamics between the United States and China. Anyways, I'm the Avid Reader, and I will see you readers next time.